Hey friends, what up? And welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Gimel, Daf 3 of Masechta Megilla. Friends, there's about 1 million awesome things on this daf. Let's just jump in, I guess. But yeah, we're still talking about like Megilla and stuff. Let's jump in because there's some super exciting stuff. So, the first thing we're going to discuss on Daf Gimel, we're actually going to start on Daf Beis and with Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. And this is actually something that we saw in Masechta Shabbos, Daf Kuf Dalet. Shmuley Perkel, of course, remember Shmuley Perkel like this daf of Masechta Shabbos, and I imagine that he's going to like this daf of Masechta Megillah, and we like Shmuley Perkel. So, that's good. Friends, let's begin. On Daf Beis and Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Says Reb Yirmiyah, some Taka says Reb Chia bar Abba. Okay, we're going to see a lot of things from Reb Yirmiyah, and some say Reb Chia bar Abba. Menatzbach Sofim Amorum. That Menatzbach, who could tell me what Menatzbach is? Menatzbach is the letters that there are 2 of them, right? Mem, for example, there's the regular Mem, the Mem Psucha, and there's the Mem Stuma, right? The Mem that comes at the end of the word, right? There's the Nun in the middle of the word, the Nun at the end of the word, Tzadi Sofit, right, etc. So that's Menatzbach, the 5 letters that have 2 of them, 2 versions. So Tzofim Amorum, the Nevi'im kind of made them up. So now, Mitzvah, 1 second. The Pasuk says that these are the mitzvahs. A prophet is unable to just make things up. And more so, Ha'amr Rav Chizda says, Mem v'samach shebeluchis, that in the luchis, the tablets that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down from Mount Sinai, so those tablets, the Mem and the Samech, B'nai Sayu Omdin, they were miraculous because, if you think about a Mem Sofit, the Mem that comes at the end of the word, it's basically like a square, and there's that middle bit that was just hanging in midair, and so that's the Mem Sofit, and the Samech Oichit, also the Samech, right? There's that, it's like, there's the space around it, but there's that middle piece which was just dangling in midair. So that was a miracle. So Memele, if we're saying that in the tablets that Moshe Rabbeinu received on Mount Sinai, they already had this Mem Sofit, so how could it be that the prophets made them up if they were already in the tablets? So in Mahavahavu, Flavu Yadehe be'emtso teva ve'besof teva. Okay, so interestingly, the Gemara says, well, sure, maybe they were already in the tablets, sure, but we didn't necessarily know which mem was meant to be in the middle of the word versus at the end of the word. And the Nevi'im said, okay, so this is the one that goes in the middle of the word, this is the one that goes at the end of the word. But but 1 second. But still, the Nevi'im can't just make these things up and decide. Rather, it must be that no. Initially, it was established that, the mem at the middle of the word goes in the middle of the word, and the mem at the end of the word goes at the end of the word. But the people forgot, Namaisa. They forgot. They didn't have, nowadays, like everything's on a computer. If something got lost, the mamish got lost. And the Nevi'im came back, and they reminded the people which was, in fact, the letter in the middle, and which was the letter that goes at the end of the word. Friends, you ready to have your minds blown? Alright. Don't say I didn't warn you. V'amar Reb Yirmiyah, v'tem Reb Chia bar Abba, says Reb Yirmiyah, some takas, say Reb Chia bar Abba, Targum shel Torah, unklus hager amaro mipi Reb Eliezer v'Reb Yoshua. Mind blown. That's awesome, right? The Targum shel Torah, of course, right, the Aramaic translation of the Torah, unklus, right? If you open up any chumash, you'll see unklus over there. So that comes from unklus, the convert, from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. That's incredible. Wait 1 second. Do we have a guest? What's that? We might have a guest. My brother is here, but he might not be a guest. Anyways, So does that mean that Onkelos was a student of Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer? Should be super duper interesting. That would put, like Onkelos, I guess, at the time of like Rabbi Akiva or something. I don't know. That's like super duper interesting. And then it says, Targum Shel Nevi'im, the Aramaic translation of the Navi, Yonasan ben Uziel Amaru, Ipik Chagai Zchayu Malachi. Or as we like to say in my family, Malachi. That the translation of the Nevi'im was by Yonasan ben Uziel. Friends. Yonasan, as we learned and Daf Chof Tes, I think, of Masechta Sukkah, Yonasan ben Uziel was the top student of Hillel. We said the lowest student of Hillel was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Tells you something about Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. And it says that Yonasan ben Uziel, he made the Aramaic translation of the Navi from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, which is incredible in so many ways. I mean, you have Yonasan ben Uziel as the top student of Hillel, and he has this translation of the Navi from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who were the last of the prophets. Now, interestingly as well, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, I think they were during the time of like Ezra, during the time of like the building of the second temple. Now, as we learned in Masechta Shabbos, so the Hillel was the last 100 years of the temple. So how does that really overlap? What does that mean that Yonasan ben Uziel, Mustama, was also in the last 100 years of the temple, which is also insane. That's incredible. But that's like when Yonasan ben Uziel lived. And then he was hearing the translation of the Navi from Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, from like the beginning of the second temple. It's just extremely, extremely interesting. When his dies at Eretz Yisrael, Abameus Parsa, and Eretz Yisrael was shaken in an area of 400 parsos by 400 parsos. Yotzu Sabaskol v'Omra, a voice from heaven came out and said, Mi huzeh shegilat Sisrai livnei Odom, who is this who has revealed my secrets to the people? Omar Yonasan ben Uziel al Raglo ve'Omar. Friends, Yonasan ben Uziel then stands up, a voice comes out of heaven, says, hey, who is revealing my secrets? Yonasan ben Uziel stands up and he says, Anihu, it's me. Shegilisi sisrecho livnei Adam. It's me. I'm the one who revealed your secrets to the people. And it's because Galav Yadua lefanecho, it's revealed and known before you, shelo lechvodi asisi, I didn't do it for my own honor. Lo lechvod beis Abba, nor for the honor of my father. El lechvodcha asisi, I did it out of your honor. Shlo yarbu machlokos b'Yisrael, so that there should not be arguments and disagreements among Israel in terms of how to understand the verses of the Torah. Friends, this is pretty dope. V'od bikesh ligalos Targum shoksuvim, he also wanted to reveal the translation of the ksuvim, of the writings. Yotzu Sabaskol v'Omra, but then the voice came out of heaven and indicated that was enough. V'Omrlo, and said to Yonasan ben Uziel, Dayecho, enough. My timer, how come? Mishum de'izbei kates Mashiach, because in Sefer Daniel it talks about the when Mashiach is going to come, and that was kind of enough. Wow, that is mind blowing. The Targum Shel Torah Unkel Sager Amaru. Now, Frekti Gemara, was the translation of the Torah really by Onkelos the convert? V'Amar Rav Ika bar Oven, Amar Rav Chananel, Amar Rav. Rav Ika bar Oven says the name of Chananel and the name of Rav. My Dichsiv, what does the pasuk say in Nehemiah? Vayikru b'Sefer Torah Elokim, that they read from the Torah of God. Meforash explained v'som sechel v'avinu b'mikra, and they understood the psukim. Vayikru b'Sefer Torah Elokim zo mikra. It says that they read from the Sefer Torah of God. That's the psukim. Meforash is the Targum. The explanation is a reference to the Targum, the translation. V'som sechel elu psukin. That's where the psukim stop. V'avinu, and they understood by mikra elu piskei taimim. That's like the tunes to sing with it. V'amrila elu amasoros. These are the different traditions, I guess, about, I don't know, maybe how to pronounce the words. So therefore the question is that apparently this pasuk from Nehemiah is already mentioning that there was a Targum, there was a translation. So how could it be that Onkelos provided the translation if the translation was already there, at least during the time of Nehemiah? So again, Shachachum v'chazu v'yostum. Yes, there was a translation, but it was forgotten, and then Onkelos, reestablished it based on, right from Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Ma'ishne de oraisa to lo is daiza v'adin vie is daiza. Now, fact the Gemara, how come when Onkelos translated the Torah, the world did not shake, and yet when Yonasan ben Uziel translated the Nevi'im, the world shook? So the oraisa mifarsha milsa the Nevi'e ikamile de mifarshan v'ikamile de mistamon. That, well, when it comes to the Torah, things are more or less revealed, more or less understood, whereas the Nevi'im, there are certain things that are understood, but certain things are rather cryptic and not necessarily understood. Tichsiv, for example, as the pasuk says, "Bayomu yigdal amisped biyushalayim kimisped adadrimon bevikas Megidon." Then on that day there will be a eulogy in Jerusalem, like the eulogy of Hadadrimon bevikas Megidon. And the thing is, apparently there was no eulogy of Hadadrimon bikas Megidon. So what's it referring to? Rav Yosef, and says Rav Yosef, Ilmele Targuma da'ikra, if not for the fact that we have the Targum Yonasan for this pasuk, lo yadayna Mike Omar. Says Rav Yosef, I would have no clue what this pasuk means. And rather what it means is bayoma ahu, that on that day, Yaske mispeda b'Yerushalayim, there will be so much eulogizing in Jerusalem, ki mispeda da'achav by Omri dekoto Yosei adadrimon ben Tavrimon, like the eulogy of Achav bar Omri, who was killed by Adadrimon ben Tavrimon b'Ramos Gilad, uchmispeda, and like the eulogy the Yoshia bar Amon dekoto Yosei paro chagira bevikas Megiddo, and like the eulogy for Yoshia bar Amon that was killed by Paro Chagira in Bikas Megiddo. So we see that it's actually referring to two different events. It says of Yosef, if not for the fact that we had the Targum Yonasan, I would not understand that pasuk. And therefore, because the Targum Yonasan really is necessary to reveal a lot more than the Targum of Onkelos for the Torah, so therefore it was a much more sensitive thing, and the whole world shook when the Targum Yonasan, was released. Says the pasuk in Daniel, "V'isi ani Daniel levadi." I, Daniel, saw by myself as Amare, the vision, v'anoshim she'ayu imi, and the people who were with me, l'ro as Amare, did not see the vision. Havachorod gedol nafal aleim, but nonetheless a great fear became upon them, befell them, Vayivruchu be'echave, and they hid. Mai ninu anoshim, who were these other people who were with Daniel? So Omer b'yirmiyah v'temer b'chiyah bar abo, Zechagai, Zechariah, u'Malachi, that is a reference to Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, inu adifei minei, ve'iu audit minayu. In some ways, they are greater than him, and in Daniel, and other ways, Daniel is greater than them. Inu adifei minei, they are greater than him, to inu nevi'eh, for after all, they are prophets who prophesied to the people. The ihu lav navi, whereas he never prophesied to the people. Ihu adif minayu, and he is greater than them, in that the ihu chazu ve'inu lo chazu, that he saw this vision, and the other, and they, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, did not see the vision. Well, if they didn't see the vision, then what did they get scared about and hide about? So afagav the inu lo chazu, mazalayu chazu, even though they did not see the vision, their vibes saw the vision. As Rashi says, what's mazalayu sar shel kol adam lemaila, each fellow's officer above. So their officers above saw this vision and freaked them out. Amravinish mamina Says Ravina, so what do we see? That a fellow who gets scared, even though he may not see the thing, his officer upstairs sees it. Wow. Well, that can... that's interesting. So how do you fix it if you get all scared? Read Kriya Shema. If you're in a place that's dirty and you can't read Kriya Shema there, so go 4 garmides away, and then I guess read Kriya Shema v'lo. If you can't do that, say the following: that the veal at the butcher is fatter than I am, i.e., leave me alone, go to the butcher. Alright. Okay, so now that we learned on Daf Beis Amud Beis from Medina and ear for these different drushes. So mishpacha l'mayasa. So when we continue in the pasuk, it says Medina v'ir mishpacha, right? So then, what do we learn out from mishpacha? I think that's at the very end of the Megillah. I think I read the Megillah, friends. You know that. So that's at the very end. I feel like it always gets a little wishy-washy, but I always figure it out. Let's go weiter. So the Mai also. So what do we learn out from there? So Amar Rabbi Yossi by Chanino, Lahavi Mishpachos Kahuna v'Levia, to teach about the families of priests and Levites, that they stop what they're doing. They stop the service in the temple in order to hear the Megillah. That's Gevaldig. We're talking about the second temple, because in the first temple, Purim didn't happen yet. So I guess in the second temple, they would stop the service in the temple in order to make sure that they hear the reading of the Megillah. To Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Kohanim ba'avodason Levim b'du chanun, that the priests who were in the middle of their service and the Levites who were in the middle of singing their songs, v'yisab ma'amodon, and as we learned about Masechta Tainis, the Yidden who were praying for the korbanos that were being offered, kulim mevatlin avodason, they all stop what they're doing, uvayin l'shmo and mikra Megillah, and they go to hear the Megillah. Tanya Nami Yochi, we tackle in a brayso like this: Kohanim ba'avodason levim b'duchon v'yisab ma'amodon kulim mevatlin avodason uvayin l'shmo mikra Megillah. That all these people who were doing their service in the temple and related to the korbanos, they stop what they're doing to hear the Megillah. And based on this, in the household of Rebbe, they would stop studying Torah in order to hear the Megillah, right? They wouldn't say, well, we're learning now, we're not going to hear the Megillah. They would stop learning in order to read from the Megillah. Kavachomer me'avoda, as a kavachomer from the service in the temple, well, if the service in the temple, which is pretty serious, they stop doing the service in order to read the Megillah, well, then certainly we will interrupt the Torah study in order to hear the Megillah. So now, Frek the Gemara, 1 second. Is that necessarily the correct logical inference? That if we take a break from the service in the temple in order to listen to the Megillah, does that mean that Memele we should stop studying Torah in order to listen to the Megillah? But that may not necessarily be the correct deducement. The pasuk says in Sefer in the book of Joshua, "Vayihi biyos Yoshua biyericho." It was when Joshua was in Jericho. Vayise'enov, he lifted up his eyes. Vayar, and he saw that he saw that there was a fellow standing opposite him with his sword out, and he says, "Hey, who are you?" And they have a conversation. He says he's an angel. Vayishtachu, and Yoshua bows down. 1 second, how could Yoshua have a dialogue with this fellow? Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, a fellow is not able to say hello to his friend at night, because we have to be concerned that maybe it's not his friend at all. Maybe it's taka a demon. So, and for the Gemara Shiny Awesome, it was different by this fellow outside of Jericho to Amar Leiki Ani Saitzva Hashem, because the fellow said he's an angel of God. He's an officer of God. So therefore, Yoshua felt that he could speak to an officer of God at night. Viduma Meshakre, Maybe the fellow was lying. Maybe he wasn't actually an officer of God. He was just saying that he's an officer of God. So, Gemire de lo mafkishim shemaim levatole. Well, he's not going to say the name of God for no reason. So if he says the name of God, and he says he's a messenger of God, so then, officer of God, so then you can assume he's an officer of God. And the officer of God says to Yoshua, he says, Yoshua, what's going on over here? That, last night, yesterday afternoon, you didn't offer the korban tamid shel ben arboim. Now you're sitting there in a what's that called when you set a trap for somebody? It's an ambush. Now you're sitting there in an ambush and you're not studying Torah. Like you dropped the ball twice. You didn't do the avoda. You didn't offer the tamid shel ben arboim. You're not studying Torah. And Yoshua responds. He says, "Okay, and which one did you come here for? What did you come to speak to me about? Why did you pull out your sword against me? Was it because I didn't offer the korban tamid shel ben arboim, or is it because we're not studying Torah?" Amlo atabasi. He says, "I came because of the current situation, i.e., you're not studying Torah right now. You already missed the korban tamid shel ben arboim, but the fact that now you're not studying Torah, that's why I've come." Miyad vayolin Yoshua balaylahu b'soch ha'emek. That is why Yoshua, when it came to the sort of one of the subsequent battles, Yoshua studied Torah at night. So we see that when there was the option that the messenger could have come, because the people didn't do the avoda, they didn't offer the tamid shel ben arboim, or because they weren't studying Torah, which one did this sort of officer of God come from? Because they weren't studying Torah. So we see that studying Torah is actually on a higher level than offering the korbanos. And therefore, why was Rebbe making a logical deduction that, well, just because we interrupt the service in the temple to listen to the Megillah, that means that necessarily we would interrupt the Torah study to listen to the Megillah. So Amr Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan Melamed Shalon B'umka Shalacha. Okay, so that teaches us that when Yoshua spent the night in the valley, it means in the valley of Torah, in the depths of Torah. Amr Rabbi Shmuel Bar Unya, it says Rabbi Shmuel Bar Unya, Gadol Talmid Torah, Yosim Akrovas Tamidin, that Torah study is greater than the offering of the korbanis. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, atabasi, that the messenger came, that the officer came because they weren't studying Torah. So lokash adaram v'ad yochid. So the Gemara says, well, it depends. In the case of Yoshua, it was talking about a communal studying of Torah, right? It was talking about it by having the ambush that night. Nobody was studying Torah, and therefore a communal studying of Torah is more serious than the communal offering of the korbanos. However, in Rebbe's situation, he wasn't talking about communal Torah study. He was talking about their own personal Torah study, and their own personal Torah study. So in that case, if we're going to interrupt the service in the temple to listen to Megillah, the Memele will interrupt our own personal Torah study in order to listen to the Megillah. The Yochid Kal. Wait, is that really true that the Torah study of an individual is more lenient than the korbanis? We talk learn in the Mishnah, Noshim b'moed me'anos avalo metapches, that on festivals the women are able to eulogize, but they don't bang on their chests. Rabbi Yishmael says, Rabbi Yishmael, hayu smuchis lemita metapchos. Okay, if they were close to a bed, they can bang on their chests. All right. Rosh Chodashim and Rosh Chodesh, B'Chanukah uV'Purim and Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah and Purim me'anos u'metapchis, and on Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah and Purim they could eulogize and bang on their chest. Bazeh vazeh lo mekonenis, but in either one they don't do these kinois chants, crying things. But none of this applies to a Talmud Chacham, Koshkin, Chanukah, or Purim, and certainly not Chanukah and Purim, i.e., that kind of overrides all of this stuff. So we see that an individual Torah scholar, so that seems to override all of these other things. So Kvod Torah Ka'amart So we say, well, that wasn't exactly the study of Torah, that was more of the honor of Torah, right? That we're saying that the honor of this Talmud Chacham, to eulogize him, sort of overrides these halachas of the festivals, but actual study of Torah would not, and therefore so kilo of an individual, and therefore what we're saying is that the communal Torah study is on a higher level than offering of korbanos. But offering of korbanos is on a higher level than an individual's Torah study, and therefore, if we interrupt the service in the temple in order to offer korbanos, in order to listen to the Megillah, so Mele, we will interrupt our individual Torah study in order to listen to the Megillah. Alright, that sounds very, very nice. Omar Rava says, Rava, pshitali, it's obvious to me. Avodo mikra Megillah, that if it's between the service in the temple and reading the Megillah, so mikra Megillah audit. Okay, so as we said, so reading Megillah is kind of like wins. As we saw from Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina, that you interrupt the service in the temple to listen to the Megillah. Talmud Torah mikra Megillah audit, midasam chushal bis Rebbe, and also that if one is studying Torah, he would interrupt his Torah study in order to read the Megillah, as we saw from Rebbe, that they would interrupt Torah study in order to read the Megillah. Talmud Torah mis mitzvah audif. Also, if it's between Torah study and a meis mitzvah, if there's a fellow who dies and needs to be buried, so that would override Torah study. Midatanya, as we learn in the Brayso, mevatlan Talmud Torah l'tzoas meis ulachnos kala, that we interrupt Torah study in order to take out a corpse for burial, as well as for marrying off a bride. All right. So we see that that a meis mitzvah, that when there's a fellow who needs to be buried, that overrides Torah study. Avodo meis mitzvah odif, as well as when there is the service in the temple, and a fellow who needs to be buried, the fellow who needs to be buried takes precedence. Mivlachoso, from the word, from the pasuk of V'la'achoso, that it says by a nazir, that a nazir, a fellow who sort of takes upon himself not to drink wine, not to become tameh, to grow his hair out, all sorts of things, so he's not allowed to become tameh meis. And it says la'avav l'imo la'achav v'la'achoso, he can't become tameh, but he's not allowed to become tameh to a corpse, and also not to his father, his mother, his brother, and his sister. The question is, if we already said he's not allowed to become tameh, Megilla, that includes his father, mother, brother, and sister. So why do we have to specify also father, mother, brother, and sister? So we learn out different things from father, mother, right, brother, right, maybe if he's a Kohen or a Kohen Gadol, whatever it is. What do we learn out from La'achoso, from his sister? What we learn out from there is the Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, V'la'achoso, that a Nazir is not allowed to become Tameh to his sister. If his sister passes away, he's not allowed to bury her. Matamalomer, how come he needs to say his sister, right? Because after all, it already says he's not allowed to become Tameh to anybody. Megilla, it includes his sister. So it comes to teach us this halacha, which is, you have a fellow, it's the 14th day of Nisan, he's going to slaughter his korban Pesach, he also has an 8-year-old son, he's got to do bris milah for his son, it's a busy day, and then he hears that somebody in his family passed away. Yochel yitamo, is it possible that he's allowed to become tameh for this family member? He's just talking about a regular person. He's got a lot of things to do. It's Pesach, he's got to offer his korban Pesach, he also has to do bris milah for his son, and then somebody passes away in his family, does he become tameh and sacrifice these other things? So, meaning, and basically, now you won't be able to do these other things. So, Amud lo yitama, it says no, lo yitama, he does not become tameh for the family member, rather, you do these other mitzvahs. Is it possible that also, if you, right, just like you would not become tameh to a family member, to your sister, or to another family member in this case, you also would not become tameh to a meis mitzvah in the same case? If you have a fellow who needs somebody to bury him, and he doesn't have anybody else to bury him, so in the same predicament, where you have korban Pesach, where you have bris milah, and then somebody passes away, and then there's a meis mitzvah, somebody who needs to be buried, doesn't have anybody else to bury them. So what do you do in that case? It says in the context of a nazir, this extra word of la'achosu to his sister, la'achosu te'enu matame, yeah, you don't become tameh to your sister, aval mitame the meis mitzvah, but you would become tameh in order to bury this other fellow. So we see that burying this fellow who needs to be buried overrides the korbanos, avodah, the service in the temple. Okay, fine. What about if it's between reading the Megillah and burying a fellow, right? Which one wins out? Because after all, we said, you stop doing the avodah, for example, stop doing the service in the temple in order to read the Megillah. You also stop doing the service in the temple in order to do a meis mitzvah. What about if it's between the Megillah and the meis mitzvah? Which one wins out? Do we say that reading the Megillah wins out, is more powerful, is on a higher level because it's Pesumei Nisa? We have to publicize the miracle. Or maybe burying this fellow wins out, Mishum Kvod Abrios, out of honor of humanity, that you have a fellow who needs to be buried. So Basudabaya the Pashta, then after Rav asked the Kasha, he answered the Kasha, Meis Mitzvah Audit, that the fellow who needs to be buried takes precedence to Amar Mar, because we said Gadol Kvod Abrios Shedoches Lo Saisa Shebatorah, that honor of the people is pushes off a mitzvah lo sase, a negative commandment in the Torah, right? As it says that by Hashavas Haveda, right? It says lo tuchal litalem, you're not allowed to hide from it, and yet there are certain situations. For example, if it's a zaken ve'enu lefi chvodo, if it's a fellow who it's beneath his dignity to have to return this thing, so that you don't worry about a Shavas Aveda, that the kavod abrios, dignity for people overrules even a mitzvah lo sase in the Torah. So therefore, Rava says if it's between meis mitzvah and Megillah, meis mitzvah takes precedence because it has to do with human dignity. Gufa, we said earlier, Amar B'Yeshua ben Levi krach b'chol hasamuch. We said at the end of the daf yesterday that a city, a walled city, and any places that are close to it, any places that are seen with it, nidun kikrach, is judged like that city. Tana somuch afapisha enu nira afapisha enu somuch. And it was taught, if you have a city that's close by, even if you can't see it, or if you can see it even though it's not close by, so bishlama nira afapisha enu somuch. I understand how you can have a city that is visible even though it's not so close. For example, if it's at the top of a city, the top of a mountain, then I guess if you have the city at the top of a mountain, I guess you can see it even though it's far away. All right. Where am I? I lost my place. Fine. How can you have a situation which is close by but not visible? Well, if it's in a valley, if it's hidden in a valley, it might be close by, but because it's so low, maybe you can't see it. Alright, what do you want me to tell you? If you have a city that was inhabited and then only afterwards it was surrounded by a wall, nidon kikfar. It's not viewed as a city. Says Rashi, it's talking about in terms of the halachis of Bate Arichoma, cities, homes that are purchased in a walled city, that if it was first inhabited and then the wall was erected only after the fact, well then it's not considered like a walled city. My time Hakam Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, Vishkiyim kor beis Moshav ir choma, that a fellow who buys a house in a walled city, that kilu it was right Shehukaf Levasof Yoshav, that it was a house that in a walled city, i.e. first it was a walled city and then only afterwards the house was built. Not that first it was settled and then the wall was only built after the fact. Not that. It says, any city that does not have 10 people whose sole, I don't know what the word is, but activity, thing that they do all day is that they just stay in the synagogue, so that there's always somebody in the synagogue. Just that the synagogue should not be empty. There are 10 people that are just always in the synagogue. Nidon kikfar. If it's a place that doesn't have 10 people just full time in the synagogue, well then it's not considered like this walled city, like this big city. It's considered like a regular, just a village. My kamash malon tanino. What's the big chiddush of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? I mean, it's a mishnah. Ezu yir gedola. What's considered a big city? Kol sheyesh ba'asar batlon. Any city that has 10 batlonin, 10 people who just are in the synagogue all day. Pachus mikan. If it doesn't have 10, harizek far. It's just a regular old village. So krach itztrich le. When we need it for like a big city, like a metropolis. Afagav de mikloi le mi'ama. Even though people are coming from all over the place, and there's always people around, and there's always going to be people in the base in the synagogue. But nonetheless, still you have to have 10 dedicated people. Even if you have a metropolis, but there's no 10 dedicated people, so it's just considered like a village. It's not considered like a big city. And says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, if you have a city that was destroyed and then inhabited, nidon kikrach, it's considered like a walled city once again. My charv, what does it mean that it was destroyed? Ilema charvu chomosav, if it means that the walls were knocked down. Yoshav in, lo yoshav lo. The what? If it loses the walls, then it has to be inhabited once again, and if it wasn't inhabited, then it wouldn't be considered like a walled city. V'atani, we learn in the Brayso, Rabbi Eliezer bar Yossi, Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer bar Yossi, asher lo choma, af al pi she'ein lo achshav, v'ya lo kodem lochin. Right? Kilu, meaning, if you're going to say that it was a walled city that had a wall and was destroyed, and then if you're going to say that the wall needs to be rebuilt in order for it to be considered a walled city, but that's not true. Any wall that had a city, any city that had a wall, and it was knocked down, even though it was never rebuilt, it's still going to be considered like a walled city. So Ella, my charav shecharv me'asar batlonin. It means that it lost these 10 people in the synagogue. If it had 10 people in the synagogue, and then there wasn't, but then they came back, so then already it can be considered like a walled city once again, and you can read on the 15th of Adar. Friends, that was daf Gimel of Masechet Megillah. Friends, there's a lot of super duper interesting stuff on this daf. For example, the letters that were established by the prophets, and Onkelos' translation of the Torah, Yonasan ben Uzziel's translation of the Navi. There was discussions about Daniel and Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and people's messengers from heaven being able to get scared for them, and the relationship between Kriyas Megillah and Talmud Torah, and the service in the temple, and how Meis Mitzvah kind of overrules that. And then some of different technical halachos by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi about what constitutes a city in terms of being able to read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. Friends, that was Daf Gimel of Masechet Megillah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.